Hey guys, welcome back to DIY Dudes. I'm Drew, and in today's video, I'm gonna show you how I built this 16 feet long by 12 foot wide floating deck in a single day without using a saw once. Let's do this. So the first step in building my floating deck was to lay out the foundation. I was doing 3 rows and I wanted to space these evenly across the length of the board. The 2 outermost blocks, I actually spaced 1 foot in from the edge so that the overhang of the deck would conceal the deck block and it would just look a little bit nicer. Now that the side foundation blocks are laid out, I'm going to lay out the back side, spacing them equally along the length of the 16-foot board. This actually works out to be 4 evenly spaced rows. I wasn't too concerned about the deck blocks being exposed on the edges in this case because I was actually planning on planting some shrubs to cover that up. Now that I had the side and the back laid out, I simply carried that spacing across the remainder of the blocks to get the rough layout completed. Okay guys, so I have the rough location for my piers laid out. And then I've also hammered in some stakes at the corners. And then what I did was I ran the tape measure at an angle in both directions to check the measurement. And what that means is I was checking for square. The measurement from that corner to that corner is the exact same as the measurement from that corner to that corner, which was pretty good for my first shot, roughly laying that out. And I'm pretty happy with this. So the next step before I start actually installing the piers is I'm gonna check the grade using a string and a line level. Just to see how much I need to raise or lower the piers. The backyard here is at a bit of a slope down that way, so I have a feeling that I'm going to need to bring that end up and then the end behind me down just to get my starting point somewhat level. Okay guys, so that was actually pretty level. So what I did there, just to make sure everything was pretty close, was in that first corner I measured from the screw I put into the stake down to the ground 14 inches, and that's the starting point for my string. And then I ran the string with a line level to each one of these corner posts. And then once I made sure the string was absolutely level, I measured down to the ground, and each corner was around 14 inches. So what that tells me is I'm pretty close to level. So I'm gonna go ahead and rough in the foundations for the deck right about this elevation. To make sure I have a strong foundation for the deck, I'm gonna dig out about 3 to 4 inches of this soiled dirt material and replace it with high quality stone. The stone I'm going to use is 3/4 inch clear stone, and I'm actually going to hand tamp that using my hand tamper. Make sure to give this a few good pounds to make sure it's nice and tight. Once I have the granular fully compacted, I'm actually going to add a skim coat of concrete material so that I can use this to level the deck. This material is a lot finer than the rough stone I'm using, so I can make fine adjustments to the deck block. In addition, once this gets saturated, it's going to firm up and be a nice solid foundation for the floating deck. Just set the block on top of the granular, see how level it is, make fine adjustments as necessary, and I'm actually going to tamp the top of the block down with my hand tamper to make sure that the base is nice and solid. And that's the process that you're going to carry on through the next 12 blocks. Once I had one side fully completed, I used my 6-foot level to make sure that the blocks adjacent to one another were pretty close to level, and then I used one of the joist boards to make sure the alignment was good between that entire row. So I've set this string line in place so that it's going to be in line with the back row of foundation blocks. Once I get the corner block in, I'm going to bring it up to the underside of that line, and then it'll be level with the foundation block on that end. So once I have the 2 corners squared up, leveled up rather, then I can do the 2 blocks in the middle, and then that whole line should be level straight across. So I finally have all 4 of these foundation blocks set in elevation, and they're generally pretty level. There's a few touch-ups I'm gonna do here and there. I'm gonna bring up a couple as well as I can shim up the bottom of this board slightly in a few areas, but it's pretty close. It's good enough for what I'm planning on doing with the joists. So I'm gonna go ahead and move on to installing the rest of these. And I'll use this corner and the opposite corner as kind of my level for the whole deck. And I should have everything pretty close when I'm done. As you're installing the deck blocks, make sure that you periodically check the spacing to make sure that your measurements are consistent and that the deck is going to be nice and square. A single deck block can support about 40 square feet of deck. Try and make sure that the deck blocks have a maximum spacing of 8 feet and a minimum spacing of 4 feet. That's generally what I use to decide on the number of deck blocks for my deck. To make sure that no weeds or grass grows up from underneath my deck, I added some basic weed barrier. This is just filter cloth that I picked up from my local building supply store. I found that the easiest way to install the weed barrier was to roll it out over everything and then cut out the deck blocks afterwards. The next step is to lay out your main support joists. Once you have the main support joist laid out, this is the time where you want to check that they're all level, and any fine adjustments can be made by either shimming up the block or raising the block by adding additional granular underneath. This is a good time to double check that everything is level before you screw it together. I'm using my 6-foot level to do this. If you only have a 4-foot level, you can actually string a board across the joists and then set your level on top of that. Now that I'm happy with the joist layout, I'm going to secure the rim joist in place using 2 3.5-inch deck screws. I wanted to make sure that none of the granular stone washed away over time, so I'm actually going to go ahead and coat them in cement powder. This is an additional measure that probably wasn't required, but I wanted to be on the safe side. Now that the main support for the deck was complete, I had to install the joists that span between the gaps. These are installed at 16 inches along the entire deck. I marked both sides of the rim joist at 16 inches, and as I installed the joists, I simply lined it up along these 2 points, and that made sure that it was nice and square. In order to install these joists, I had somebody hold the board on the mark at one end, and I screwed in the opposite end on the mark using 2 3.5-inch deck screws. And then simply repeat that process throughout the rest of the deck. Now that all the joists are installed, I can finally start to install deck boards. Because I designed the deck around the size of the lumber, I simply had to just throw the 16-foot deck board on top and screw it in place. No cutting required. First thing I did was lay out all the deck boards, and then I got to work screwing them in place. I made sure that my first board was very square along the front and the sides, and then I simply screwed all the adjacent boards tight to that. In order to make sure the deck boards were being installed tight, I used a prying technique. I used a chisel to hammer into the deck, and then I pried the deck board tight against the adjacent one and screwed it in place. If you install all of the deck boards tightly together, once the wood shrinks a little bit, you'll end up with a little bit of a gap. After several hours of screwing in deck boards, I was finally done. Alright guys, so I just wrapped up building this floating deck in a single day with very basic tools. In fact, I didn't even use the saw once. This thing looks great, and if you guys like this video, please subscribe for more content. See you next time.